Thank you everybody so much for your time today. I hope this is a useful lunchtime session for you all. I'm going to be sharing some research that I hope is new and I hope is thought-provoking. And I'm also delighted to have our two speakers who are going to talk about their experiences around these two topics, around psychological safety and cognitive diversity. But before we get started, some of you may have heard me say this before, so apologies, but some of you may not. But before we get started, I would like to say, imagine I said to you that you were only invited to continue with this session today if you had a degree, if you were at least 25 years old to be able to understand the complex neuroscientific principles that we're going to be talking about today, or you're a parent in order to have enough empathy and emotional intelligence or understanding or compassion. If you didn't fall into any of these categories, or even if you did, if you had any type of emotional reaction to those statements that they felt a little bit exclusive rather than inclusive, what you actually experienced was a threat to your psychological safety. Threats to our psychological safety or stress or stressors, what happens is the amygdala, which is the fight or flight part of the brain, responds to stressors in the same way. It doesn't differentiate between emotive or physical threats. It just treats them as a threat. And we process 11 million pieces of information every second. 99% of those pieces of information are unconscious. They're automatic. We don't even know they're being processed by the brain. And constantly our brain is filtering that information for threats, things that we need to remove ourselves from. And with those physical threats, those stressors, if we have any indication from someone through a glance or a word or an emotive suggestion that it might be a risk or a threat, what happens is our adrenal gland will produce cortisol, the stress hormone. Now we need the stress hormone most of the time to get up in the morning, to prompt ourselves into action. But if too much of that cortisol can actually be a problem. And the reason why this is an issue with psychological safety is because we have a negativity bias. Because our brains are constantly, our minds are constantly scanning the environment for these threats, we have this thing called a negativity bias. And we are constantly prepared. The reason I mentioned the age of 25 being the level at which we might have been mature enough is because at 25, our prefrontal cortex is fully developed. And that's the judgment side of the brain. That helps us to rationalize and understand and recognize whether the threat is real or not, or whether the other person might be just having a particularly tough day. And the issue is very often we have triggers. All of us have certain triggers that really impact us and are likely to send us over to feeling lower in terms of our resilience. And some of the triggers that I think are really relevant to psychological safety are related to the David Rock scarf model. So if we have threats or stressors to our status, certainty, and so on, if we're not feeling valuable, or we feel like our needs are not being met, or we're not able to make decisions, or not feeling included, or it's not fair, then what happens is that we're going to be on alert. And when we're on alert, we are producing the hormones and the neurotransmitters that suggest we need to either fight or we need to get out of there. If we're having that type of response and we're responding to these triggers, we're very unlikely to feel safe. So let's look at what is psychological safety. Psychological safety, according to Amy Edmondson, who really brought the concept to life 20 years ago with her research in hospitals, is all about candor. So she personally doesn't even like the term psychological safety. She doesn't like the label. And I've listened to scores of podcasts and talks with her in and read multiple books. She doesn't like the term psychological safety because actually what she finds, as do we, some of our clients really struggle with that language and that term. In truth, what we're talking about is candor. It's speaking up, speaking honestly, speaking plainly, and being prepared to take interpersonal risk. So teams that feel psychologically safe, and the word that's important in that sentence is feel. Teams that feel psychologically safe are more likely to make suggestions, ask questions, and innovate. And the research is really showing us that psychological safety is not the destination, it's the vehicle for success. And psychological safety in combination with cognitive diversity is a real winning formula because it enhances innovation, belonging, and so on, as it says on this slide. The good news is, with all of the books I've read around psychological safety, they're all pretty consistent in terms of their definition and in terms of the impact safety can have on a team or an environment. One of our clients sent us this piece of research, which was fabulous because it was hugely relevant to the work we're doing at the moment. And Refinitiv, which is part of the London Stock Exchange Group, they conducted some research on workplace sentiment. Workplace sentiment is analysed through AI and assesses social media posts about certain organisations. And they were assessing whether workplace sentiment through those posts were positive or negative and the impact it has on share price. But particular, they were interested in psychological safety and generic safety. And what they found is that organizations that are more focused on health and safety and psychological safety have a higher share price. And these are some of the organizations that were in the top 5% of that research, and some of them that were at the lowest end. And so this is starting to show that there is a direct correlation between performance and this concept of psychological safety. So psychological safety is a climate, it's not a culture. Culture is about values, rules, ways of engaging, whereas the climate is a result of that culture. And a climate is very much about how people feel. So if you were to ask someone about the culture of the organization, very often it's about the acceptable ways of working, and it's pretty front of mind. Most people can describe it. When you ask someone about the climate of the organization, everybody's perspective might be different. Everyone might have a different view or a different feeling of the team or the organization. And what's even more fascinating is that I might, for example, work in one team and feel completely safe. And then I might pivot 90 degrees, work in another team and feel completely unsafe. And that leads me to a point that Amy Edmondson says, that no organization that she has worked with is truly psychologically safe. When she's asked, she points to 3 organizations that she feels are closest to achieving that goal. They are Google, Pixar, and Salesforce.com. We have the great privilege of working with 2 of those organizations. And when I've spoken to senior leaders from both of those organizations about their psychological safety, their comment is they're on the journey, but they've got a long way to go. So even the ones that Amy Edmondson says are truly safe are still working on it. To continue with the story about what is psychological safety, we know from the research it's not about being nice, it's not about being complacent or saying what people want to hear. Nor is it an intelligence, a belief, or a personality, albeit it correlates with personality. So psychological safety correlates negatively with neuroticism and positively to some extent to openness to experience. Our research that we're going to show today also identifies that strengths and taking a strengths-based approach to assessment and to building teams positively predicts psychological safety. So if you have cognitive diversity and various strengths within your team, they are more likely to be psychologically safe. If you have a homogeneous team, they're more likely to be unsafe, is the suggestion as a result, according to our data. But the most important point is the greater the cognitive diversity through the strengths of the team, the more likely they are to be safe. So this is our model. We have articulated psychological safety using 10 scales. Many of our fellow researchers talk about psychological safety more in terms of steps or ladders, that you have to progress one step to move to the next. For us, we believe that there are 10 aspects, and that every team that we have so far worked with has a different concept of psychological safety. They might be high on a few things and low on others, and average on the majority. We are finding that, though, that there are 3 aspects that are critical for a psychologically safe team, and they are trust, purpose, and connection. They're the foundation for psychological safety. I'm just going to give you a moment to read the slide. I wonder, when you're reading that slide, are you surprised by some of the language on the right-hand side of the unsafe teams? Because some of those things at face value could appear to be good, to be nice, to defer to leadership, to want to please, to be professional, to have consensus. But in truth, our research and the research of the other psychological safety authors really indicates that these things undermine trust, and they undermine innovation, risk-taking, and thinking progressively and acting progressively. One thing I will always forget to say, and I should mention now, is that we have a product which assesses psychological safety, and you can become accredited to use it. So if you would like to get accredited to use our product on psychological safety, to use our questionnaire or cards, the next session is on the 27th of the month, and we also have one on the 29th of June. And if you're thinking about using this product internally within your organization, you'd be welcome to join us. So how do you know if your team is psychologically safe? Of course, you can use our product, you can assess the team and understand where the risks and the strengths are. But you could actually just reflect, and these are Amy Edmonds's indicators rather than our own. You could reflect on, are people asking questions? Are they admitting to mistakes? And are they innovating? Are they making suggestions? If the answer is no to any of those questions, then they may be holding back. And that might be an indication that they're not feeling as safe as they could. The real reason this is important is what we want organizations to try to avoid is functional stupidity. Functional stupidity is when we blindly follow rules or regulations or processes, and we follow the status quo. We trust the community, we trust the culture, we trust the values, and we don't question why. It's amazing that we work with so many organizations where the greatest challenge they have is that they don't give their team time to think, that it's relentless. I'm increasingly hearing that the area of psychological safety, relentless, is one of the greatest risks during this pandemic, during remote working, going back to back, from meeting to meeting, and having absolutely no time to think. And all of these things point to us really losing that sense of innovation and creativity, curiosity, and disruption. And so psychological safety, as I've said before, is not the destination, but it's the vehicle for all of those things. And what we want to do is remove any risk of functional stupidity. So cognitive diversity is not diversity of demographic characteristics, which of course is critical because it's the right thing to do. It's diversity in terms of thinking and beliefs. And the important thing here we found from our research is about the journey each of us have been on through our lives to get to the point that we are at now in our careers. If we all have exactly the same journey, go to the same Russell Group or Ivy League universities, we all have similar professors, similar friendship groups, and we've all studied similar courses, we are going to be trained to think similarly, even though we might be men and women, we might be from different ethnic groups, and we might have different sexual orientations. And so that diversity of thought comes from the journey through the learning, the lessons we have. And many of our clients are struggling with this because they have longevity. They have longevity within their organization of 20 plus years, which is fabulous in some ways, but actually can create challenge in others. The evidence is there. Cognitively diverse teams are more innovative, they are more disruptive, and we know from our research now are also more psychologically safe. As it says here, if we focus on strengths, we can increase engagement. We can also, of course, now we know that we can increase safety too. So some of the books that I've been reading that have really informed this session, which I thought you might be interested in, you've probably read them, but the Matthew Said Rebel Ideas is an excellent book, and I'll be referring to his research quite a lot in the next section. I loved his thinking. I've listened to a lot of podcasts, again, that he's been invited to contribute to or he has hosted. And another book that I would recommend that I've really enjoyed is the Physical Intelligence book, and I've referred to this quite a lot on the slides, by Claire Dale and Patricia Paynton. They are two books in addition to the books around psychological safety that have really started to help me and have been informing my thinking. We wondered whether to put this up because when I showed the team this slide, I got some concern back around the labeling. And so I did a bit of Googling to try and work out what's the correct labels for some of these things. What am I allowed to say and what am I not allowed to say? You know, am I allowed to talk about color? Am I allowed, or do I talk about ethnic origin? And when I'm referring to color, what do I say? The same for neurodiversity, for sexuality. And in the end, I decided to be brave and put it up, because I felt that actually the point I want to make is that diversity is rich. It's truly, we're all completely diverse in so many ways, and that we should be proud of that diversity. Sadly, the people who might be nearer to the middle of this might feel like they have greater opportunity, but actually the real opportunity in my mind comes from having people from all walks of life, from each of these different categories. And that's truly what we're talking about today. Because the research has definitely identified that if we bring people in to the team or to the organization who have different yet competitive or different strengths to one another, then they will create safety. And these are the strengths that in particular predict psychological safety. So if you bring, for example, people into the team who have strengths around being articulate, attentive, compassionate, and so on, they are more likely to create a climate, which is how people feel, where people speak up and share ideas. So these are direct correlations, significant correlations, and there was over 6 months between the strengths assessment and the psychological safety assessment. So we know that one predicts the other. So each of these strengths contributes to a safe environment. which really helps us to understand the importance of cognitive diversity, people thinking differently from one another, and psychological safety. I'd now like to ask Derek, if you wouldn't mind, Derek, I would like to now ask you to be interviewed, if you don't mind. So what I'm going to do is ask Helen to spotlight Derek rather than me, if you don't mind. Okay. And Derek, what I'd love to do is just ask you a few questions. If you wouldn't mind, would you mind just starting by introducing yourself, Derek, and telling us a little bit about your story?
Yeah, so Derek Bruce, and obviously two Christian names do confuse people. So Derek Bruce, Bruce, a surname. And basically been working in the L&D and HR field for the last 30 odd years or so. And in that time, I've managed to work in L&D, in HR, in leadership development, but also in some great industries. So newspapers, media, technology, financial services, and alongside back in different countries. So currently based in Amsterdam, but originally from London, worked in the UK as well. So in terms of seeing the evidence of this research and seeing some of the things up close, I've had lots of experience in time, but also narrative examples of where I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Derek. That's brilliant. And so my first question for you is, what do you believe the role of the leader is in creating a psychologically safe team or organization?
Yeah, I mean, my current role is leadership development at a technology company. And for me, it's essential. It's kind of a role which creates the whole employee experience, but also creates the right climate and the right culture. And if leaders don't have the ability to consider and be cognitively diverse, but also look at things from different perspectives, it kind of filters down and has this wave upon wave upon wave of impact on their teams. So for me, the role of a leader is kind of essential in making sure they understand the consequences and impact and the pros and cons of having the right climate, which then leads to the right culture, which then leads to, hopefully, the right performance as well.
Thank you. So are you talking about role modeling then? So if you're talking about the role models, what experience do you have of excellent or good role models, bad, and maybe even ugly, as you said?
Yeah, I mean, if I look at role models, the role models in my career and in the organizations I've been in, who have been the ones who I use as examples when I talk to other leaders, are the ones who, and you mentioned risk, for example, aren't afraid to take risk and aren't afraid to support their teams taking risk as a really obvious behavior. They're also the ones who are able to build the right elements of trust and actually be open and honest about where they are, what they're doing, and not playing the corporate political games as well. They're the ones who get the most out of people. But also they're the ones who bring all these policies to life. So if anybody's worked in HR, we can kind of throw policies out of, I was going to say a rude word then, we can create lots of policies. But if they're not used, if they're not brought to life, if they're not followed, all the things that you try to do well to create the right environment, the right culture aren't there. And the good leaders are ones who actually understand the importance of these. I think if you look on the flip side, the leaders who are kind of the ones who don't role model things are the ones who, as you said, they need to have the control. There's a whole phrase around control and control and contrast. They're the ones who need to be the ones who you come into them, you check in with them, you make sure it's okay, you ask, can you do things? That kind of difference in behavior, I've seen a lot with leaders, and the ones who role model the negative stuff have a negative impact. And obviously it's obvious. So I think the whole thing around the good, the bad, but also there's the ugly, which is the leaders have good intentions. So even though they're thinking they're doing the right things, I'm helping, I'm supportive, I'm doing the whole, everybody has a viewpoint, they're the ones who then teams kind of use the leader as a crutch. And if you're talking about the ability to be psychologically safe, it's also the ability to do and trust and use your voice and your abilities. And by unintentionally, some leaders are very, very good at creating a wrong environment by thinking they're creating a right environment, by saying, you know, I'm here for you, I'm going to support you, you need to check in with me. which aren't the behaviors which people need to be psychologically safe.
So what I'm hearing then, Derek, is that if we have leaders who are too controlling, that even if they have the right intentions, they're almost too supportive, or they try to be there too much to have the answers.
Yeah.
Is that what is potentially a risk in your mind for psychological safety?
And I think so, because if you look at the style of leadership over the last 10, 50 years and how much has been spent on leadership development, the whole arena has moved forward a lot. It's not around, I tell you, I control, I give instructions, very much around kind of two-way, you know, contracts which are between employee and an organization. And it's very much around everybody getting a win-win situation. And the control element is historical. If I look at my organization now, leaders were in engineering, which was a very black and white industry. As we've moved into technology and the Internet of Things, our leaders don't know what to expect, but their teams do. And they employ people to kind of drive topics forward. And our leaders also then have evolved to be happy to say, do you know what? I don't know, but I'm sure you do. Or I trust you to find out, or I'm going to trust in your ability. And if we mess up, okay, we learn from that. And that's the evolution which supports having a psychologically safe organization. But I think the point you made, I've never seen it, as you mentioned, in any of the organizations I've seen across the board. I've seen pockets of great stuff, pockets of goddamn awful stuff, and pockets of stuff in the middle as well. But the big thing I've seen is it's very much driven in terms of the culture and the climate by what the board are doing. And if the board at least try to embrace it, you see a different impact in the organization. If they don't, that, as I said, waves and filters down.
Thank you. Do you know what was running through my head then is accountability, which of course comes back to Amy Edmondson's research. She talks about the winning formula being psychological safety and accountability. Ours is those two things plus cognitive diversity too, because everybody then comes together and innovates. So I love all of that, but I completely agree with you. The organizations we're working with are massively different depending on the leaders of those organizations. And we've worked with a couple of organizations that are doing incredibly well because they've got a leader who is embracing inclusion, embracing diversity, and embracing safety. And then another couple of organizations that I won't mention the names of, who have fundamentally fought the concept of psychological safety, and they think they're just poo-pooing the idea and don't believe that it exists. And they are two of the most unsafe organizations that we work with currently. And what happens in those organizations is that we see leaders of teams beneath those very senior exec leaders creating pockets of safety and putting their arms around their team and creating safety from within. The risk, of course, is diversity disruption, because those teams are looking to one another for that sense of safety, but they're not looking outside to understand what's happening in the rest of the organization. They almost become islands. So we have lots of little islands across that organization. So fascinating. And so, Derek, my next question is around the link between cognitive diversity and psychological safety. I know for me, I'm singing rapt lyrical about these two things, but I'd love your view, please.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's kind of, well, first of all, I think diversity and similar to psychological safety kind of has a bad press as a word. And I think it's like Brussels sprouts, and for me anyway, I hear Brussels sprouts, like, oh my God, it's like just sweats and panic. And I think diversity has that same kind of context with lots of people. And people think, okay, so I've got a woman, it's all good. Or I've got somebody who's young, it's all good. When in fact, the cognitive element of it is very much around, as you mentioned before, having a different element and different ways of thinking. And if I think about, again, organizations where the teams have diverse people from diverse backgrounds, and that is where they've worked best. And there's an example of an organization years ago I worked with, which had an amazing team, different countries, different genders, different races. But as a management team, they all went through the same kind of from 15 to 35 pathway in terms of education, in terms of friends, in terms of traveling, in terms of all the experiences. And if you kind of ripped away the faces, the people, the roles, and just had a blank persona, they would all live in the same kind of area, drive the same kind of car, marry the same kind of person, have the same kind of pets. which meant as an organization, the diversity of thought just was never there. And that mirrored down. So in terms of the organization, it didn't have that innovative, creative spark, because everybody who came in was the same kind of persona. So for me, the link around having that diversity cognitively is so important, because if you don't have that, you can't create the psychological space or the right climate, because no one actually knows anything different. You're all kind of reading the same newspaper, as opposed to going, okay, that's the Daily Mail, I don't like it, but I can get a viewpoint. That's the Sun, okay, I don't like it, that's the Guardian. For English papers, sorry, again.
Yes.
Apologies if you're not from the UK. So for me, there's a huge, huge impact on having the ability to bring in that cognitive diversity. But the challenge is, if you're surrounded by people like you and things are working well and you're successful, the question is, why do you want to change it? And it's only changed when things go bad, not when things are going well. So that's kind of a challenge I have in my leadership role, which is, when we're doing well, let's make sure we bring in the kind of difference we can use to make us get to the next level. Let's not wait until it's a nightmare time as well. But there's a huge link between it. But diversity in itself, we need to kind of move away from people thinking it's just one element to expanding on the cognitive element of it as well.
Thank you. And you very kindly brought us in to think about biases, because one of the biggest biases for psychological safety that works against psychological safety is that similarity, like me, like you bias, where people are naturally attracted to people who have similar views and opinions to themselves. It helps us with our personal belief, our self-confidence. And so we naturally recruit people who are similar, because it helps us to believe that we have a place in the organization. It validates who we are. But actually, the opposite should be true. We should be recruiting people who are very different to ourselves. And so that's leading me nicely into my last question for you then, Derek, which is, what do you think organizations should do to create cognitive diversity?
It's a great question and probably need more time. But I think one of the things is, it kind of fits into the whole, how do you create diverse organizations, full stop. And I know there are different policies, there are ways you can use measures and metrics to actually support it. And you mentioned around bringing people in, simple things like, when we recruit, let's make sure we don't recruit from the same place we've always recruited from to get the same people, because that's when we're going to change it. Let's make sure we bring in different types of people as a mandatory measure, so we have interviews with different people. Let's have a 4-eye principle on how many people we're bringing in from the same organization or same source as well, for example. So recruitment is kind of one of those big things. And even down to looking at the diversity of how we write adverts from an HR perspective. Are we using the right kind of words to appeal to different people? But when we then get people in, make sure the recruitment process is fair and unbiased, and then make sure once we've got people in, we also create the right environment they can actually utilize what we brought in as well, and is successful. And one example I could think of is, we had, in a company I worked in previously, great ability to get women into senior roles, for example, and get women from different backgrounds. But once they were there, the environment didn't change. So they'd only stayed in roles for a maximum of 18 months. And that was the big issue, not getting them in. It was actually, once they were here, how do we support that to make sure we are cognitively diverse? So that's where the focus was, in terms of, okay, mechanisms, development for people who are managing these people, but also support mechanisms for people in those roles where they could be open and say, look, this isn't working, this is why, how can we change it as well? So it's around the climate, it's around the connections, around creating the right policies, but it's also around challenging the status quo. For me, it's kind of the biggest thing is, what we've always done isn't always going to work. So it's challenging the status quo.
Thank you, Derek. This is a nice segue again to the research that we conducted a few years ago. We interviewed 42 C-suite leaders, a few of them are on the call here today, and they were women who had achieved great success to get to board level. And I asked them about the journey, and Sarah and I interviewed many of them with our colleagues, and we content analyzed all of the research and found that the real indicator or predictor of their success was inclusion. Actually, it was about the CEO of that organization and whether he or she included them, mentored them, and listening to them and treating them as equal was so important for them to feel like they had a future in that organisation, which is fascinating. Thank you, Derek. Thank you so much. So Helen, if you wouldn't mind removing the spotlight, I'm just going to share a slide, and Derek, I'd love your comment on this slide once I share it, if you don't mind. So hopefully.
I look amazing in that. Oh, wrong one. Okay.
Oh no, not that one. Yes, you do.
Lovely jacket. Yeah, this was something which I saw, and it's been doing around a couple of the last year or so, and it was all around the Black Lives Matters and the fact that we have this all lives matters, blue lives matters, whatever, all the Karens, to use a phrase, kind of talking about stuff. And I think this is kind of where we need to challenge the status quo when it comes down to the focus. Yes, we do need to make active differences to support diversity where it is not in place, because everything else is normal. And if it's not normal, you're not going to actually then make it normal by then actually focusing on and saying, okay, yes, we appreciate if you're a generalization, white, middle-class man, you may feel, what's the word, discriminated against, to use a phrase, but actually it's because you've never had that situation. And even with you being discriminated against, you're still better off. So this is kind of why this graphic for me is a real thing I use and look at all the time in terms of this is the way we can bring in more diversity cognitively and all the other elements way as well. Thank
you, Derek, so much. Brilliant, and thank you for your contribution today, incredibly insightful. So I'm going to just take us through a little bit of content now around cognitive diversity, and then I'm going to introduce Harry as my second interviewee and speaker. So let me just talk about the benefits of cognitive diversity. So we did some research ourselves. So we asked the question of our clients, and most of our clients believe that cognitive diversity results in improved problem solving, as it says here, but also the breadth of knowledge, the fact that they come to the team or to the meeting or to the organization with different ideas and different perspectives. Our research has actually found that there are significant differences, for example, between men and women. Sadly, some of this feels a bit stereotypical because women are more self-aware, attentive, compassionate, emotionally intelligent, and so on. Men are more achieving, competitive, courageous, decisive. So I'm slightly annoyed by that because I quite like some of the male characteristics, please. But actually, these are statistically significant differences between men and women. So we do think differently on average. Individually, we may not. I might be a very competitive, achieving, decisive, courageous woman. But on average, men and women think differently. So that's one of the ways we could bring in cognitive diversity. We could bring it in, of course, through ethnic differences, through sexual orientation differences, and through that history difference that I talked about already. And I'm really pointing towards that journey that we go through in our lives and the lessons we have, because it significantly impacts the way in which we make decisions and the way in which we think. So we want to have people who are not all from Ivy League universities or Russell Group universities in the UK. We want to hire people from different walks of life. And this really then points us to the Matthew Said research around rebel ideas. He's identified some really interesting research and looks at the difficulty of having a homogeneous or homophily type of team where everybody is similar. His book refers to 9/11 and talks about the CIA having a white as rice culture and how they actively recruited and worked against recruiting ethnic minorities or women, because they said, why would they dilute something that's already superior by doing the right thing, which is to recruit diversity? What they didn't realize is that if you increase the racial diversity in your team by 1 standard deviation, so statistically, you will increase productivity by 25%. That is a significant statistic. And what this page is telling us is that you might have one very big, intelligent individual, or you might have a team of moderately intelligent people, but all completely different from one another, they collectively will be brighter than that one super brain because they challenge each other. If you have a whole room of intelligent people, clones, all thinking similarly, having similar stories and trajectories, what happens is they get stuck. They get stuck on a problem and they all agree with one another and they celebrate how brilliant they are because they all have the same idea. But actually what we want is an intelligent team, a team of rebels, to Matthew Said's point, who all disagree with each other, but they have a purpose, they have a cause. What we want to avoid is the hypo issue, the highest paid person's opinion. And I can see Jimmy Garner, I don't know how to say your surname, Jimmy, but you're new to us and you've given me some amazing insights in the last week about the work that you did a few decades ago, I believe, with the Bedouin tribes and how they created inclusion and how they removed this hypo, highest paid person's opinion issue, which Jimmy very kindly gave us some information to say that their strategy within the Bedouin tribes is they put everybody in a circle. Everyone would be equal, no matter their age or rank or longevity or status. And what they would do is they would go around that circle and they would ask the youngest person or more junior person first their opinion, and then they would work around the circle to the most senior who would make the decision. So there would be no opportunity for the team to parrot the highest paid person's opinion. And that's again how another strategy for creating cognitive diversity, which is you get the quieter people, the introverts, to speak up. And the research by Thompson in 2013 has identified that actually the larger the team, the fewer the number of people who contribute. So in a team of 4, 2 people do 62% of the talking. In a team of 6, 3 people do 70%. And the percentage goes up and the number of people contributing goes down the larger the team. So if we want a cognitively diverse team, we want to make sure it's small and compact and truly different, and that everybody is contributing and nobody is parroting the leader. So Helen, if you wouldn't mind now, please, in a moment, I'd like to introduce Harry. And I'd love, Harry, if you wouldn't mind, I've stopped sharing my slides. I'd love to interview you for a moment. Thank you. Hi, Harry.
Good morning again, or good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Very early morning for you. Thank you so much for being here today. So Harry, you very kindly introduced yourself, and you and I met each other nearly 20 years ago, which seems amazing. And I was wondering if we could start by just asking you the question, what does diversity or even cognitive diversity mean for you with your story and your history?
Well, you know, I learned a long time ago that people are different. People develop in different ways. And years ago, I attended a seminar, and one of the themes was, who you are is where you were when. In other words, you developed based on your experience. Everything that you are is based on all your experiences in life. And everybody can bring something different to the table. If you if you don't, as a leader, take advantage of all the different talent in your group or on your team, your organization is going to suffer. I have a cabinet form of government where I brought in people of various backgrounds to do various things. You know, I've always felt that no one can do everything, and a leader who thinks he or she can is fooling themselves. No one can do everything, but everybody can do something. Everybody has the potential to contribute if you let them, and if they feel that they're part of the team. If they don't feel part of the team, if they don't feel that they're important, then they're not going to contribute. As you say, they're going to sit back and listen. What you really want to develop in people is the ability to feel comfortable to share ideas and to talk.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, Harry, sorry. I think it's a really interesting point there, because there's a good link between resilience and psychological safety, and our research has identified there is a positive correlation between resilience and psychological safety. So people or leaders who are not feeling resilient themselves, who aren't feeling confident, to your language, themselves, can create an environment where other people don't feel confident or don't feel safe. So really interesting. And I was wondering, and I'm going off script here, Harry, so apologies, but I was thinking about, I got challenged by another client who suggested that some of the aspects of psychological safety, for example, deferring to leadership, while we say it's not a good thing to defer to leadership, you need to make your own decisions, there are situations like 9/11, where you were one of the first responders, where people absolutely have to defer to leadership and they have to understand and take commands. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind telling us about your time during that period as police chief, and how did you create a sense of psychological safety at this time, Harry?
That's important. And what you said is exactly true. Leadership can be situational. There are times when the team can sit down, work together, and solve a problem or work on a problem. There are other times when you can't do that. You don't have the time to do that during certain emergencies. You have to use all your training and experience, and a leader has to stand up and take the lead. For instance, on 9/11, we are about 30 miles outside of New York City. If you look at that area behind me, over to your left, your right, my left, that's where we saw the smoke from the Twin Towers during the attack. That's how close we were. We knew that we had people coming home, and we had to attend to them and make them feel comfortable, make them feel safe. In Norwalk, we lost 14 residents in the World Trade Center attack. 14 of our people were killed. So we had people that we had to meet at the train station. But not only that, we wanted to make sure they got home safely. We didn't know what their psychological status was going to be. But not only that, then we had to work on making our community feel comfortable, because people didn't know what was coming next. This was very foreign to us in the United States, this attack on our own land, very, very foreign. And it was something that we never envisioned could happen. So we had to plot out from ground zero to beyond what we needed to do to make our own residents feel safe. And we had to put in place different protocols. So at 4 o'clock in the morning, every one of my police officers would check every school in the city of Norwalk to make sure that there was nothing different from the day before, because we knew of the possibility of an explosive device that could be placed near a school building to further disrupt our lives. And that's what terrorism is all about. You disrupt the life, you make people feel unsafe. It's not necessarily the death and destruction that they're trying to accomplish. It's disrupting lives, making sure people don't feel safe, disrupting your government. So we had to do all those kinds of things to make sure that people in our community felt safe. We sent people down to ground zero to assist the first responders that were there. We had to determine, are we going to need to form regional safety or law enforcement organizations working together so that we make the region feel safe? So it was quite a challenge, to say the least.
Thank you, Harry, because what's so interesting there is that true sense of safety. Because if we go back to the first few slides I was talking about, with real physical threat versus emotional threat, you've got both in that situation, haven't you? So everybody is personally struggling. So if you think about our response to it, the stressor is true and it's real. So your job in creating that sense of comfort, that sense of confidence, and that sense of safety, that was something that was absolutely key for you as the police chief during that period. And I understand that you were very vocal about the work that you were doing in the community to make sure everybody understood that the leaders were truly leading and were role modeling.
And again, that is critical. That's one of the most important jobs during a catastrophic event or a crisis. That is one of the most important jobs that a leader has. But there's also room for the team as the things start to unfold, because the team then needs to get their arms around what is going on and work together collaboratively to determine what needs to happen next. Once the immediate threat is over, then the team kicks in.
It's such a good point, because I was listening to Amy Edmondson about leading through a crisis and leading a psychologically safe organization through the crisis, the pandemic. And what's really interesting is that she was saying that leaders need to step up, they need to be present, they need to be visible, they need to be vocal, and they need to lead from the front, which is a really interesting point, because actually there are times as leaders that you need to be decisive, and there's times that you need to be inclusive and you need to embrace the diversity. But it's making sure that everybody recognizes that there is those two times. Thank you, Harry. I've got one last question for you, because you have had an amazing career with, is it 41 years in the police, 4 years in the Navy, 17 years chief of police. And I had the great joy of going to the chief of police ball one year with you, which I remember very fondly.
Yep.
And then finally, 8 years as mayor.
8 years as mayor, hopefully 2 more coming up.
Okay, and so what have you learned, Harry? What's the big thing you've learned during your amazing career?
Well, I think I touched on it a little bit, that nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. I think one of the most important questions a leader can ask is, what do you think? Because if people, like I said, don't feel that they're part of the team, they're going to shut down and they're going to sit back and listen. I also read a book a long time ago, and I wish I could remember. I remember the name. I don't remember the author, so anybody can take a look at it. The title of the book is, "If It Ain't Broke, Break It." The idea behind that is something may be working well, but take it apart. Take every little component and look at it, because if you can make an improvement in a little component of a whole idea, when you put it all back together, the whole is going to be better than it was before. So it's just, leadership is a challenge, and you have to make people feel a part of the team. So if I could say that I've learned anything in the past, it's, again, relying on your team, because I've said it already twice, I'll say it again. No one can do everything. No one can do everything, but everyone can do something. Everyone has the potential to contribute if you make them feel part of the team and if you let them.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you so very much. That was brilliant. And Helen, thank you. If you wouldn't mind stopping the spotlight, Harry, we'll come back to you hopefully at the end for some questions, if you don't mind. And that's just a point for everybody. I'm going to invite questions, if you wouldn't mind putting questions into the chat, and Sarah will be monitoring and managing the question process at the end, if there are indeed any. So Harry, again, thank you so very much for your time here today. Let me just take you through the last part of this session. So could I just confirm that you can see my slides? So those of you with camera on, could you just nod at me?
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Yep, fabulous. So let's just go through a little bit more research that we've conducted, and then we're going to finish with a Q&A. So I've been talking a little bit about my challenge around longevity within organizations. It's great to have a few people in your organization who have got great longevity, because they bring, as this research has shown, great breadth of depth and knowledge. But actually the risk is, if you've got a lot of people in your exec who all have been in the organization for a very long time, they will all have the same depth and the same breadth of knowledge, that they'll all very kindly be concurring with one another, and will be having the risk of similarity bias. And so we ask questions about what's the risk then of this longevity. And it seems reasonably balanced, actually. It seems that the majority of people are saying the risk of longevity of a top team might be the maintenance of existing ideas. It could also be reticence to change, or homogeneity, or homophily. And so we want a bit of both. We want diversity. We want people who have been in the organization for a very long time, who truly know the culture and the journey. and some who are new. So how do we recruit for cognitive diversity? I listened to another podcast that made me harumph a little bit, because it was about recruitment of cognitive diversity. And my view, being a strengths-based researcher, was that, well, of course, you recruit people with different strengths. But actually, it challenged my thinking, because the research has shown that if you recruit people who are curious, learning agile, prepared to ask questions, and who listen, they create that feeling of cognitive diversity, the culture or climate, of cognitive diversity. So, okay, I was prepared to be corrected, and I was corrected, that you can recruit then for cognitive diversity into your team. I mentioned earlier that I believe that the real winning formula is cognitive diversity, psychological safety, and accountability. And if you are also prepared to ask some really good questions along the way, as Mayor Harry has just mentioned, ask good questions, then you truly will create an inclusive culture where everyone feels like they are part of something that's really important. The organisations that we are looking at that are really struggling with psychological safety, both of the two most senior leaders in those organisations, they were not prepared to even embark on the conversation. And that's one thing I would say is to be careful of. If you're thinking about getting accredited to use our product and use it with your clients or internally within your organisation, please don't focus on psychological safety as the journey or the destination or the tool. Focus on high performance, focus on team effectiveness, on inclusion, on diversity, on innovation, or whatever your agenda is, but use psychological safety as one of the vehicles, as one of the conversation starters, rather than the destination, because it could turn off people, or some people could be a bit fearful of that term. And so really what we're trying to do is help organisations be high performing through accountability and safety. The truth is most organisations I work with are in the anxiety zone, particularly with this very relentless requirements that we have. And we need to help leaders feel more resilient, because there is a significant correlation between all of our scales, all 9 resilience scales correlate with all 10 areas of psychological safety to some extent. Some of the correlations are a bit low, so we've just highlighted the ones that are the most significant here. So resilient leaders, resilient individuals create safe environments. If you're not feeling composed, if you're not feeling optimistic, if you're not feeling confident, for example, you're less likely to create an environment that's safe. So if you're feeling on the other side, anxious, worried, cautious, self-conscious, vulnerable, then you're not going to personally contribute to an environment of safety where other people should be feeling confident, supported, included, and so on. It makes sense, but I always love it when the data proves us right. And just a couple of other slides to share. I've been listening to some amazing podcasts, which I would love to share with you. The podcasts are the Huberman Lab. And this guy here, if you can see it, he is absolutely fantastic. He's a neuroscientist from Stanford University. This year, he started doing weekly podcasts on the neuroscience of hunger, of emotions, of resilience, of sleep, and lots of different things. And I've been learning with reading books like Physical Intelligence all about the neuroscience. My first degree was in psychopathology and psychology, so I'm loving going back. And what the research is really showing is that we've got to put ourselves in the best place as individuals and leaders to contribute to cognitive diversity and psychological safety. So this was adapted from the Dale and Payton book, but also from the work and listening to the Huberman Lab. And what it's really saying is that we need to do everything we can to help ourselves cope with the stressors in the best way, so that we don't have that fight or flight response, and so that we can be more rational. And we can do that by making sure we release the right neurotransmitters and the right hormones. Interestingly, we hear a lot about oxytocin, the love hormone, being so good for us. But actually, it's really hard to release oxytocin. There's only a very few small things that do it. It says here playing with a pet or holding hands, but it comes from real, true love for something, a child or a partner. And we know that dopamine is important. So the kind of the little wins, so celebrating those successes, that's really important. But the research I'm reading now and listening to is saying that serotonin is the real one that we need to focus on to help with resilience. And that comes from us looking after ourselves, exercise, luckily eating, thank goodness, but eating dark chocolate and bananas because it releases serotonin. And that mood stabilizer is something that really helps us with our resilience. And so the right balance of these things helps us to become stronger, helps us with our resilience, helps us to deal with those stresses. And what's really interesting is it's different combinations of these things. So, for example, I was reading that acetylcholine, which is all about balance and focus, in combination with adrenaline and a bit of dopamine, helps us with focus. And so acetylcholine, you need that to help you with concentration, for example. And these are the neurotransmitters or hormones that we sometimes need to manage and not have too much of. So we know cortisol, which is the stress hormone. We don't want too much of that. We can monitor it. We can kind of manage it through breathing. A lot of it's through breathing, actually. And we can also manage it through our exercise and through tea and so on. And so we need to think about the way we look after ourselves in order to be resilient leaders. We, of course, can assess ourselves using our resilience questionnaire. But if we want to be resilient, serotonin is the one that's really going to help us. And we want a little bit of the acetylcholine for focus. We need a bit of the testosterone for the strength. We need the oxytocin. We need the DHEA, which is the performance chemical for stability. Melatonin, because that will help us to feel relaxed and restful at the end of the day. And dopamine, that we feel like we can succeed. But we need the right combination, and we're only going to do that if we take care of ourselves. And so I wanted to finish the message today is that if we want to make sure we're truly resilient, and this is our resilient tool, we assess aspects of negative and positive emotions, we need to put ourselves in the best place possible to do so. And one exercise you might want to do is to think about a time when you were feeling overwhelmed. What were the negative, or when you were feeling overwhelmed with an emotion, what were the overwhelming negative emotions that you were feeling at that time, or the overwhelming positive emotions that you were feeling at that time? Which ones are you more prone to experiencing? And what coping strategies can you put in place as a leader or as a contributor of a team to help to continue to contribute to psychological safety? And if you do feel like you need to change something, I've been looking a lot at physical intelligence, and a book that I came across on my research journey was Tiny Habits, and I just love this. I'm always fighting with my weight and with exercise, and I'm starting to use this methodology to create long-lasting change. So if you want to personally create long-lasting change for yourself as a leader, to be a resilient leader, or to, as a leader, to create psychological safety, these are some of the steps that you could follow. And so I'm going to stop sharing. And I just want to say thank you so much to Derek and to Mayor Harry for your contribution today, and for all of you for joining us. I think we were up to about 160 people at one point, which is absolutely amazing. I love this virtual format, and I really appreciate your time. Our next session will be in about 6 months' time. We run these twice a year, as most of you now know, and it's going to be on imposter syndrome. So it's our new area of topic. We're really interested in the impact cognitive diversity actually has on imposter syndrome, or the feelings of imposter syndrome, or counteracts indeed. So we're now focusing on our imposter syndrome, and we'll be inviting 2 more amazing speakers to help me with that session. So I hope you'll join us at the next one. We'll be advertising over the next few months. And if you'd like to buy and use any of our products, resilience, strength, psychological safety, or other tools for your client work or within your organizations, you're very welcome to get trained. There's no charge for that training. And it's open to people who are intending to buy and use our products within their practices or their organizations. And we'd love to see you there. So thank you, everybody. If you wouldn't mind commenting on LinkedIn about the event or just posting any comments, we'd love to see your ideas and your thoughts. And please tag Derek, Harry, myself, Sarah, and any of the team. That would be amazing. Thank you all for contributing. Thank you, everyone.